Let's continue adding and subtracting rational expressions. Example 8. 2x plus 3 divided by x plus 6 minus x squared plus 3 divided by x squared plus 4x minus 12. Our first step is to factor our denominators. My first denominator is already a linear factor, therefore it is prime, so I don't have to do anything to my first denominator. I still have 2x plus 3 all over x plus 6. I am going to go ahead and put it in parentheses so I know I tried to factor it. Minus, and then I look at my second fraction. I can see that I can factor my second denominator using MIFTERM. You can pause here so you can factor. I end up getting x squared plus 3 all over x plus 6 and x minus 2. Now I'm going to figure out what my least common denominator is. My least common denominator must contain every single factor from the denominators of my fractions. I have an x plus 6 in my first fraction, and I also have that same x plus 6 in my second fraction. So I know my least common denominator must contain an x plus 6. I can see that I also have an x minus 2 in my second fraction that is not in my first fraction, so my least common denominator must contain the x minus 2. Now I'm going to multiply in what's missing. I can see that my first fraction doesn't have the x minus 2, so I'm going to multiply in an x minus 2 in my numerator and an x minus 2 in my denominator. But I'm going to remember that because I'm multiplying it in and there was already a binomial there, I must put that 2x plus 3 in its own parentheses. I can look at my second fraction and I can say, okay, there is a minus sign in front of it and a binomial after the minus sign. So I'm going to make sure I put that in parentheses, and I'm going to notice that this one already contains that least common denominator, so I don't have to multiply anything in. I'm going to combine my fractions into 1. So I end up with 2x plus 3, x minus 2, minus parentheses x squared plus 3, all over x plus 6 and x minus 2. Now I'm going to simplify my numerator using the distributive properties and combining like terms. 2x times x gives me a 2x squared. 2x times a negative 2 gives me a negative 4x. 3 times x gives me a positive 3x. 3 times a negative 2 gives me a negative 6. In front of my next set of parentheses, I can see that there is a negative 1 in front, so I'm going to distribute that. Negative 1 times x squared gives me a negative x squared. Negative 1 times a positive 3 gives me a negative 3, all divided by my least common denominator, which was x plus 6, and x minus 2. Now I'm going to combine like terms. I have a 2x squared and I have a negative 1x squared. 2 minus 1 gives me 1x squared, so I'm just going to write x squared. I can combine my negative 4x, my positive 3x. Negative 4 plus 3 gives me a negative 1x, or just minus x. And then I have a negative 6 and I have a negative 9, so I'm going to go ahead and combine those and I get minus 9 all over x plus 6, x minus 2. If I were to try to factor this using MIFTERM, I would be unable to because x squared minus x minus 9 is prime. So this is my answer. Let's take a look at example 9. I have x plus 2 over x squared minus 4 plus x squared minus 7x plus 6 all over x squared minus 4. My first step is to factor my denominators. You can pause here while you factor using difference of squares. I end up with x plus 2 divided by x plus 2, x minus 2, plus I have x squared minus 7x plus 6 divided by, and I'm going to use the same factors using difference of squares. I got x plus 2, x minus 2. Now I'm going to look at my least common denominator. my least common denominator, must contain my first x plus 2 because it is located in both denominators, and it also must contain my x minus 2 because it is located in both denominators. So I don't have to multiply anything in, and I can just go ahead and combine my fractions into 1. I end up with x plus 2 plus x squared minus 7x plus 6, all divided by x plus 2, x minus 2. Now I'm going to simplify this fraction using combining like terms. I can go ahead and combine. I have an x squared. That is the only x squared, so I'm going to write it down. I have an x and I have a negative 7x. Remember, there's an imaginary 1 in front, so I have 1x minus 7x. That gives me a negative 6x. And then I have a positive 2 and I have a positive 6, so I get a positive 8. All over x plus 2 and x minus 2. I can factor my numerator using MIFTERM. I'm going to multiply my leading coefficient in my last term. I get an 8. I need two numbers that will multiply to give me 8, but add to give me that negative 6. I can use a negative 4 and a negative 2. I'm going to divide by my leading coefficient of 1. Those don't reduce, so I can put my x's in my denominators, and I can get the factors x minus 4, x minus 2, all over x plus 2, x minus 2. Now we're back to simplifying rational expressions when we have a factor numerator and a factor denominator. I can cancel the factors that they have in common. The factors that they have in common are the x minus 2 in the numerator and the x minus 2 in the denominator. I end up getting x minus 4 all over x plus 2. And this is my answer. Let's take a look at example 10. I end up with 10 plus 3v squared over 4. Now, if you get something like this, don't let it throw you off because we've done this before. We're going to go ahead and change the 10 into a fraction. I end up putting my 10 over my 1, and now I'm looking for my least common denominator. My least common denominator between a 1 and a 4 is a 4. So I can multiply in a 4 in my numerator and a 4 in my denominator. I end up with 40 plus 3v squared all over 4. Then I look at that and I can tell that there is nothing more that I can do. So this is my answer. There's one last thing that I wanted to show you. Example 11. Let's say I had x minus 2 all over x minus 3 plus 3x minus 4 all over 3 minus x. If you have something that is like this and you notice that in your denominator you have an x minus 3 and the other denominator is a 3 minus x, and they're almost the same, but the signs are wrong because you have a positive x and a negative 3 in your first denominator, and if you were to rewrite the second denominator, you would end up with a negative x and a positive 3. Well, these are almost the same, but our signs are wrong. Anytime this happens, what you can do is you can rewrite your second denominator as negative x plus 3, and you can actually factor out a negative 1. So I could rewrite my denominator as negative parentheses x minus 3, where we would factor out a negative 1. I could rewrite my fractions as x minus 2 over x minus 3 plus 3x minus 4 over negative parentheses x minus 3. And now they're almost exactly the same. What we would do is we would change the signs that are in the middle of the fraction, because what I want to do is I want to pull this negative out in front of my fraction, and it's going to affect the sign that's in the middle. So whatever sign that is there, it's going to become the opposite. So I would end up with x minus 2 divided by x minus 3 minus 3x minus 4 over x minus 3. Now this is something that you can work out. I have a common denominator already, so I can go ahead and combine these into one fraction. Because there is a minus sign now, I would have to make sure I put parentheses around my second numerator, and then I can combine them into one fraction. When I combine them into one fraction, I end up with x minus 2 minus parentheses 3x minus 4 all over x minus 3. I would have a negative 1 in front of the parentheses, and I could go ahead and distribute. I would end up with x minus 2. Negative 1 times 3x gives me a negative 3x. Negative 1 times negative 4 gives me a positive 4, divided by x minus 3. Then I could go ahead and combine like terms. I have a positive 1x and a negative 3x. 1 minus 3 gives me a negative 2x. Then I would have a negative 2 and a positive 4. So negative 2 plus 4 gives me a positive 2 all over x minus 3. I could then try to factor out my negative 2. I would have a negative 2 parentheses x minus 1 close parentheses all over an x minus 3. I would notice that there's nothing that cancels. I would write my answer as the fraction with the simplified numerator. That's the last one that I wanted to show you, because sometimes you have denominators that are almost the same, but your signs are switched. This is an easy fix. Thanks for watching.